The source of the Atlantis myth. Solon was treated like a celebrity in Egypt. And so they said, okay, we're going to take you to the temple and show you the story of how your people defeated and repelled the Atlantean invaders. So, they brought him to the Temple of Neith. Now, Neith is an Egyptian goddess of wisdom and war. And so with that, they actually saw Neith as very similar, if not the same, as the Greek goddess Athena. And they actually thought that both of their cities, so Sais and Athens, were both like cousins in that way because they had the same patron deity. And so that's also kind of where some of their camaraderie comes from. The Egyptians bring him to the temple. They show him this great story about how thousands of years ago, the Egyptians had this empire and they were conquering everywhere, and Egypt was scared, and then all the other Greek cities were falling, and then Athens stood alone and repelled the Atlantean invaders, and then they tried to do like a counter crusade against Atlantis, but then disaster struck. The Great Deluge, a flood and catastrophes, and Athens and Atlantis were both destroyed, although there were survivors from Athens. And the Egyptians were mostly saved from these catastrophes, attributing it to the Nile. They say that the Nile protected them, right? And so Solon learns of this and translates the story from Egyptian to Greek, and then takes this story with him, probably for the rest of his travels. And he comes back to his home in Athens and finds Athens in shambles. So it turns out that 4 years into his journey, his 10-year journey, a new guy rose to power, a relative of Solon named, Pisistratus. So Pisistratus became a tyrant, which is exactly what Solon was trying to prevent. And so Solon didn't have the time to actually finish or publish this poem about Atlantis, because now he was trying to help the people rebel and rise up against this tyrant. And there's actually a pretty cool story of how he went to Pisistratus' house dressed in his battle armor and tried to rally the people to rise up against Pisistratus. Nobody cared, and it was a failure. And he died pretty soon after of natural causes. And so he still had these papers, probably just in a closet somewhere, of Atlantis. And this got passed down to his friend named Eurypides. Not much is really known about Eurypides, but supposedly Eurypides then gave it to his relative, which was named Critias the Elder. Not much is super known about Critias the Elder, but supposedly at a party, Critias the Elder, being 90 years old at this point, tells the story and gives these papers to his grandson, Critias the Younger. And Critias the Younger is actually going to be the source of the Atlantis myth. Now, nearly 180 years after the death of Solon, Critias the Younger was partying it up with the other elites of Athens during a festival dedicated to Athena. It's a multi-day festival, and the organizer was Socrates. And Socrates, he's talking to his people, and he's asking them, hey, we're trying to celebrate Athena. Does anybody have any glorious stories of Athena or the Athenian people that they can share so we can commemorate this day? And Critias the Younger says, I actually do have a story. Now, it's going to sound like a myth, but it is true. And it's something that you might not have heard before. But it talks of this great deed of our people's. And Socrates is like, oh, I'm interested. Yeah, tell this story. And well, this story was the Atlantis report. And particularly this first time is what we call the Timaeus report. The Timaeus report is actually kind of short. It's only a few pages long, but it doesn't really talk too much about Atlantis itself. It's mostly focused on Athens and how it fought against Atlantis. And so it talks about the rise to power. And this is also the Timaeus report is largely where the story of Solon going to Egypt and where all those details come from is from the Timaeus report. It's basically Critias giving some context, and then he just gives a brief rundown on Atlantis. So, like, it sunk 9,000 years ago from the time of Solon, and yeah, we defeated them, and it was super good, and then we got destroyed, so not super good. And then he ends the report by saying, this is all I have to say today. However, I do have the notes, a copy of the story, and so when I go home tonight, I'll make sure to go over it more and try to memorize all the details. And tomorrow, when I come back, I'll give a more detailed account of what happened. And so that report, the next day, is called the Critias report. So while editing, I saw a mistake in the research that I wanted to take time to clarify and correct. Initially, I thought the Critias gave the first Atlantis report on a whim, and then came back the next day after having studied it during the night, so that way he could give the more detailed telling of Atlantis. In actuality, he was reminded of the myth the day before, and wanted to tell the story, but actually held his tongue, so that way he could go home, study up on the details, and then give a full, accurate telling. And he gave both of those reports in the same day, but in two different segments. I'm not really quite sure why he chose to break it up, and it's actually kind of goofy because the person who breaks up his two different reports is a guy named Timaeus, which is where the name of the document comes from. So oftentimes when you look up the Atlantis report, what's called is the Critias and Timaeus report. Timaeus really doesn't have anything to do with Atlantis whatsoever. He was just some random astronomer and like cosmologer who just gave this big old thing spiel about mythology and the stars in between the Atlantis reports. And it actually consists of most of the document. Like, I would gander probably 70% of the Atlantis report is just Timaeus ranting about stars. And I mean, I couldn't read through all of it, I gotta be honest. But the first Critias report to me actually seems like it's more of a journal entry from Solon. So, it seems like it probably was originally written in the first person, and then it was adapted into the third person to better fit like a story. And the second report is probably the actual Atlantis story directly translated from the Egyptians into Greek, right? So they both come from Critias. I'm pretty sure that this is what's really going on. It's kind of difficult because, gotta be honest with you, the internet has a lot of misinformation about the Atlantis reports, and there are sources that were straight up telling me that the first report, like Solon's journal, was called the Timaeus report, and that's just straight up not true. They were both told by Critias, and so I'll probably try to refer to them as Critias 1 report or Critias 2 report, or I'll just say Solon's journal and the Atlantis translation. I think that makes sense. In this report, Critias spilled all the beans, going into very, very minute details about Atlantis. This is where we get our information that it was these concentric circles and like the diameter of the islands, and like we get the stories of the mythology of how Atlantis was set up and Poseidon and like these 10 monarchs. So a lot of this information. And it also goes into why Atlantis was destroyed. It was because they were becoming prideful, forgetting the gods. And Zeus got angry and annoyed at their hubris and decided that he was going to punish them. And this is actually what it says. Here's the direct quote. Zeus, the god of gods, who governs his kingdom by law, having the eye by which such things are seen, beheld their goodly house in its grievous plight, and was minded to lay a judgment on them, that the discipline might bring them back to tune. So he gathered all the gods in his most honorable residence, even that which stands at the world's center and overlooks all that has part in becoming. And when he had gathered them there, he said, that it ends. There's nothing more. That's the end of the report. It doesn't even talk about exactly what happened when Atlantis was destroyed, the aftermath. It just abruptly ends. It was left unfinished. And why? Well, quite simply, there's actually no primary records of this festival, of these people talking in this conversation. All this information calls from something that we call the Atlantis Report, which was written by Plato probably around like 380 BC. And funnily enough, this report is also unfinished. Plato never published it, really. It only became known after his death. And there's a couple problems here as well, and that is that just the timeline, Plato would have been around 5 years old when this festival was happening. This festival most likely took place, if it did take place, was like 420 BC. And so Plato probably didn't hear it firsthand. We don't know who passed it to him. Maybe it was Socrates himself, but probably not. And there's that gap in the timeline, I guess you could say. But here's kind of like where we've been at, right? So the line of transmission, you could say, of all the mouths that the Atlantis myth has gone through is an ancient game of telephone. So this gap in the timeline, along with other details, has led to the prevailing theory called invention theory, that Plato just made it all up. As the Egyptian propaganda to promote the Republic, his idea of the ideal state. This is actually what his contemporaries said about the Atlantis report when it came out, not soon after Plato's death. So this has been the theory basically since we've known about the Atlantis myth. We've thought, this isn't real. And, fair enough. There's a lot of gaps, a lot of questions about it. But in the midst of all these naysayers, there was one supporter of Plato soon after his death. This guy was named Crantor, and he was a student of Xenocrates, a known philosopher. And he asserted that, no guys, trust me, this is real history, okay? And unfortunately, we don't actually have any first-hand records of Crantor and his work. It was all lost, which is surprisingly common for Greek historians, sadly. But we do know some of his ideas from a different guy named Proclus, who was actually a contemporary of Crantor. And Proclus was just compiling all these different theories and debates about Atlantis, and he didn't actually give much of his own opinions. He was just presenting other people's opinions. But one thing that he said, that Crantor said, which has always been very interesting, is that the Atlantis story was recorded by the Egyptians on a pillar in the Temple of Neith, and according to Crantor, it still stands. This ambiguous comment by Crantor has been the source of much speculation. For instance, was he saying that the pillar still stood when Plato was writing it? When Critias was talking about the story? Was it when Solon was still there? Was he talking about right now, the pillar still stands? How would he know about this? Did he go to Egypt? Did he see the pillar himself? Did he ask the Egyptian priests if it was still there? Or did he just make it up? Because this pillar isn't talked about in the Atlantis report by Critias or Plato or Timaeus. So where did Crantor get this idea from? We don't know. Debate between whether the record was on papyrus or on a pillar, like Crantor says, is actually a pretty big deal. And there's actually, when you stop to think about this, it actually brings up some other questions. Like, how did the Egyptians keep this record for so long? Because according to the Cretaceous report, Atlantis sunk 9,000 years ago, which would be like 10,000 BC, almost 12,000 years ago now. And your problem with that is that nothing really exists from back then. And so let's say that soon after the events of Atlantis, you have the Egyptian society, which supposedly still exists, and they write down, what happens. And now this record that they wrote has to survive almost 10,000 years. How? Well, you're like, oh, they wrote it on papyrus, and papyrus can, it can last a long time. And yeah, sure, if it's not in a human environment, it can last like maybe 1,000 years. I think the oldest papyrus that we've discovered is like 4,000 years old. So let's use that as the maximum lifespan of papyrus. So you have the Egyptian, he writes the thing down on papyrus. Well, every 1,000 years, let's say, you're going to have a new Egyptian guy come in and record it from the old decaying version of Atlantis onto a newer papyrus to preserve it for 10,000 years, which means that by the time it gets to Solon, you've gone through at least 9 different, I guess, what would you call it, transmissions from copying it. And another problem there is that Egypt didn't keep the same language for 9,000 years. We actually pretty well know some of the changes in language from hieroglyphs and whatnot. And so we know that there is at least 4 major language changes, significant enough to where people, like someone from Egypt in the Old Kingdom, would not be able to understand someone from the Middle Kingdom or the classical era. And the exact sequence would be, I believe it's pre-dynastic language to Old Kingdom language to classical Egyptian to Demotic, which is what the priest at Nath would be speaking. So at the very least, 4 full translations. Who's to say that the Egyptians didn't make any mistakes? And who's to say that no invaders came in and burned the library or the temple, destroyed it, and then the record was lost? The likelihood that this record survived for 9,000 years is almost impossible. I mean, and even if you say, oh, well, if the Temple of Nath had it in stone, maybe it was just always there. Well, not really, because the Temple of Nath was constructed, we think, sometime around 3000 BC. And even then, King Amasis is known for adding an addition to the Temple of Nath, and he loved the Greeks. So it's very possible that he's the one that, that had that pillar erected with the story of Atlantis, because he's like, this was a cool part of Greek history. So then the record must have been translated from the papyrus to the pillar in year, I don't know, what would it be? 575 BC, something like that. So, and this is also something really unfortunate. We can't confirm if this pillar exists. You might be thinking, oh, well, if it's on this pillar, maybe we can find it. No, you're not going to find it. Why? Well, because pretty soon after King Amasis died, which is in year 525 BC, the Persian army invaded. And the emperor of Persia, I think it's Cambyses or something like that. I don't know how to pronounce his name, honestly. Whatever. That Persian emperor destroyed Sais. It's actually kind of funny how he waged war against the Egyptians. What he did is he put cats and dogs at the front lines of his own army, because it's against the Egyptian religion to harm cats and dogs. And so that way the Egyptians wouldn't shoot arrows at the Persians. And it actually worked. The Egyptians refused to shoot at the cats and dogs, which allowed the Persians to just shoot the Egyptians. I think there is some debate whether that actually happened, but that's at least a story, right? And according to, I think it's Herodotus. The Persians came through and just destroyed everything, burned temples to the ground, and specifically, they had something against King Amasis, because the Persian emperor commanded that Amasis's body be pulled from his tomb and then beaten, stabbed, and burned. And then the entire temple leveled. And, well, some people think that, well, maybe the destruction actually wasn't that bad because your source is a Greek, and the Greeks don't like the Persians, so that's probably Greek propaganda. But in any case, I'll put on a picture of what the Temple of Nath looks like today. Yeah, there's nothing left. You're not finding anything. What is real? What do we actually know that is real? This is going to be pretty controversial, not going to lie, but it's in the Bible. This is a huge deal. This potential correction completely changes the game.